Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare magazine podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we'll be looking at Volume 12, Issue 2, Wild Allies and Enemies, Thracians in the 4th Century. With me to discuss the topic is Jasper Oorthuys, Dahm, Marc DeSantis, Lindsay Powell and Myke. And it's hello to those patrons who watch us recording live, and a thank you for your support. If you enjoy the podcast, why not become a patron at patreon.com/Ancient Warfare Podcast. We do send a link out to patrons before we start recording for them to watch the magic live. So let's get started. Jasper, who were the Thracians? Why have you devoted an issue of the magazine to them?
For our main ancient topics, the Romans and Greeks, there's a few sort of standard, standard barbarian threats. And for the Romans, it's the Celts, and maybe later it's the Germans, but mostly the Celts really. And for the Greeks, the Thracians seem to have sort of a similar role early on, but they very quickly they start to trade with the Greeks, and they just sit there right at the northern border of where all the city-states are. And that in itself makes it an interesting topic, and it's also a somewhat difficult topic because, insert standard whine about sources here, but it's, they haven't hardly, I think there's a very few sentences, but in the main, the Thracians have not left us any written sources about what they did and why they did things, but they have left a lot of archaeological material, and a lot of that is not very accessible since it's in either northern Greece, and mainly it's in southeastern Bulgaria, which of course was completely hidden by behind the Iron Curtain until 1989, and it's now that material is being exhibited in museums in Bulgaria, and it's going on. Exhibitions are going on tour across the world, and it's just their metalworking is magnificent. And if you look at it, it very clearly influences Greek styles of arms and armor later on in the Macedonian Hellenistic period. So all that combined makes it for a topic that we definitely had to tackle sometime, and a topic that was not really easy to do. So we focused in this issue really on the middle of the 4th century. We have an article on one of those Thracian royal graves, which was almost complete, and a sort of a discussion of everything that was found there, and a reconstruction of what the Thracian prince who was buried there might have looked like in his entire getup. And we have an article which had to be from the other side, but Alexander the Great, really, we seem to be saving Alexander the Great up for some later date. I don't really know why. It's not really on purpose. But we don't do very much with him in Ancient Warfare. But this time we do. We have an article on his very first campaign. Before he goes east, he goes north to secure the borders. And we have an article, a sort of combined article by two authors about the Paeonians, who, to be very honest, people don't really know for sure if they're Thracian. They're probably Thracian. They may not be. They may not have considered themselves to be Thracian. This is one of those things where people, where academics look at language traits that, as far as we know, where they live, how they interact. But they're interesting because, of course, they supply Alexander's army with some of his very early famous elite troops, the Agrianian Infantry, that's the Paeonian tribe, and the Paeonian cavalry. So, I thought it was an interesting short theme. There's a lot of other stuff in this issue of Ancient Warfare, but that's what we have on Thracians.
And I've vaguely forgot where I was going, because I made a note of something else. But what was I going to say?
If you're looking for a controversy to start with,
Fire away.
Okay, cool. We could start with the identification of Thracians as barbarians, which is something I think that's we're able to dispute. We have the establishment of the Oorthusian kingdom. I mean, forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. We have the founding of Oorthuys as a major Hellenistic city. We have the Thracians acting as significant military and political forces, both in the Persian Wars and in the Peloponnesian War. And we have the argument that the Hellenistic kingdom of Bithynia, which I think we can hold up next to Pergamon as one of the great Hellenistic kingdoms of the Hellenistic period, is founded and settled by Thracians in the Hellespont. I think that the reason we have a tendency to think of them as barbarians, the same thing we do with Celts, is because of the lack of literary sources. Put us at the mercy of Greeks talking about them, and we know how they're going to be represented. But we could kick off with the argument, I think, that this barbarian civilization may be a lot less barbarous than we think.
Well, maybe it's somewhat easily sort of undercut by just saying, for the Greeks, barbarian just means anybody who doesn't speak our language. Period. It's not necessarily a value statement, although they have lots of stories about Thracians that sort of do fit with our ideas, a sort of modern idea of barbarian, a modern idea of an ancient barbarian, namely somebody, who likes to drink and likes to fight and do everything in a somewhat unorganized manner, but mostly likes to fight. I mean, if you're familiar with the Games Workshop variant of what orcs are, it seems like that's where they got their inspiration.
The other thing I think about their cultural longevity is the fact that both the Paeonians and the Thracians are present in the Iliad as separate cultures. I was reading recently, doing some work into Euripides' Rhesus, as you do, which might not be by Euripides, obviously. But the Rhesus in the Iliad, of course, is that Diomedes and Odysseus go out into no man's land, and they come across Dolon, and they decapitate him simply because he's wearing a wolfskin, which is a bit weird. But he tells them about Rhesus's horses, and they go and they kill Rhesus, all his men, and steal his horses. But in the tradition that comes across in the play, Rhesus has been at the Trojan War for a single day and has killed many of the Greeks and devastated them on that single day, and so he's basically killed after one day's warfare. But in the Homeric tradition, Rhesus hasn't fought yet. So there's kind of an alternative tradition, not in Homer, that the Thracians are great warriors who are very dangerous and need to be destroyed, which is sort of part of the idea that you get in the Homeric tradition, as well as that's also a great source of decent horses. So there's a really interesting sort of longevity of the Thracians and the Paeonians as great warriors, because of course later on, especially from the 4th century onwards, they become ubiquitous. The phrase with the Agrianians and the Paeonians and the Thracians as being peltasts, even though we think that the peltasts are separate, they become sort of synonymous with Thracian peltasts. And even though we know that they provide other kinds of troops, they are, they're sort of this sort of ubiquitous inclusion in most 4th century and Hellenistic armies, which is a really interesting sort of development that, and again, like we were talking about with Cretan archers, are they in fact from Crete? Probably not. They're just Thracian, as in we call them Thracian because they're armed in a particular way. And the other thing in art, the Thracian depictions in art are standardized. The geometric patterns on their clothing, the peltae shield, which is even called the Thracian shield, even though, again, we don't think it's Thracian necessarily, and other people use it, and it becomes a style that's adopted by other cultures because of its usefulness. It's quite a remarkable spread of their influence, even though that influence might not be theirs. But they certainly had long established culture and a warrior culture.
Which, of course, also is worth mentioning, goes way past the Greek and Hellenistic era into the Roman era, where we have plenty of evidence for Thracian auxiliary units. And oddly enough, Thracian, the Bessi, another Thracian tribe, turns up a lot more than you'd think of, you expect, in the Italic Praetorian fleets.
Well, let's not forget, for example,
a mountain tribe in the fleets. It's amazing.
In that interesting window between the fall of the late Roman Republic and the so-called Empire, they are still an independent nation. They're an ally of the Romans, and they are called in on their treaty terms. For example, during the Battonian War, 6 to 9 AD, and they acquit themselves quite well, or they do screw up in the first year. But the Rometalkes and some of these other members of that family fulfill their military obligations quite honourably. And again, they do it very well. It's interesting enough is the way that the political aspect of the Thracian royalty they get sort of sliced and diced in different sorts of ways. And eventually, I think, is it under Claudius that whole area eventually becomes absorbed as a province? But they have that independence, and they're quite reliable allies if you're with them.
Two fine points I wanted to go. Jasper, to your point that of the flat denial based on the Greek conception of anybody who didn't speak Greek as barbarian, I think the sources are very clear in painting Thracians as barbarians in the orc sense that you mentioned. I'm seeing Diodorus here describing them. I have Diodorus here saying that he's talking about the Getae, barbarous and lead a bestial existence, live in a wintry land deficient in cultivated grains and fruit, normally sit on straw, eat from a wooden table, and drink from cups of horn or wood. And then I have Tacitus saying that they're capering and chanting in front of the battle lines. There's a lot of examples of them really being described that way.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I just wanted to say, barbarian, that's what it means. However, it seems to be fitting in how the Thracians are described. But we also have to remember that both Greeks and Romans have a tendency to think of themselves as, the core of civilization. And the further away physically you go from there, the stranger and weirder people get. And you see that it's true, in Herodotus. And that's why, the Teutoburg forest takes place in mountains. I mean, when the sort of the area Germania Inferior, where I live, is described by I think it's Cassius Dio. He talks about that's far away from Rome, so therefore there are high mountains and swamps and stuff. Well, the swamps is correct, but the mountains not so much. It's just a sort of a standard thing.
He's complete. The further these people they are away from, they are barbarians. I happen to know.
Yeah, but everything else becomes that's true. Everything else becomes. Hey, you're from England. England is even worse.
As the New Zealander living in Australia, I think I might have to start some fisticuffs if the internet if you're going to start talking like that.
Oh, so the other thing I think is if we're going to talk about Thracians, we got to tackle the word peltast. This is a source of great differentiation for me that I think is important to address. When people talk about Thracian peltasts, I usually picture a lightly armed javelineer with a crescent-shaped shield, like the crescent of a moon. But the reality of it is that all peltast means is men who bear the pelte, and all a pelte is a small shield. The way I picture it is you have a fighting world in the Greek world, which is dominated by the large aspis of the hoplite, and then when people talk about other kinds of shields, you have the Thraeos, which is notable because it's oval, not round, it has a central spine. And then you kind of have small shields, what we call in Latin the cetra, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and the pelte in the Greek. But wait, say it again, because
Gaita, it's a C, and which in classic Latin, therefore, as we discussed before you came on board, is pronounced with a K.
I have so many deficiencies as an historian, and language just kicks my ass all day long. So I appreciate that. Thank you. But the reality of it is if you look at like Iphicratean peltasts, these are phalangites, right? Or you have peltast corps in successor kingdom armies that are pes heteroi, foot companions. So when we talk about Thracian peltasts versus other kinds of peltasts, it's really important that we keep that distinction in mind. I really view it as a general term for any kind of shield that's small and not an aspis or a Thraeus.
Well, and then you have the problem that we're really discussing a period of several hundred years, and the meanings of words do change.
So why did they? Is there a reason why they came up with are known for light troops? They're next door to Macedonia and things. Is there some reason why they came up with that as opposed to?
Well, I'm going to guess it's geography. I'm looking at a map of Thrace, and there seem to be an awful lot of mountains and rivers, not terribly flat plains and that type of thing. So you want to be lightly equipped and manoeuvrable.
But then why doesn't Greece come up with the
exactly?
Or why do we have heavy hoplites?
Because they're not barbarians.
It's kind of bizarrely. But they've got no flat terrain to fight heavy lines of infantry charging each other, and yet that's the warfare they develop. Whereas we've got these other.
Could this be a lack of central organisation?
Because the Greeks had one big state, you mean?
Well, no, because if you have large cities and some way of government controlling them.
But you have cities in Thrace too, and I'll give one example. Iphicrates, the inventor of, in my opinion, the phalangite as we know in the army of Alexander of Macedon. He was in the court of King Cotys, and in fact had an army of 8,000 troops in his service that won serving as peltasts in the literature. And this is one of the points where I start thinking about. So Iphicrates is certainly somebody who is a heavy infantry commander in the Greek style, an Athenian, and he's winning a battle with an army of peltasts. And we all assume that because he's serving a Thracian king and training Thracians, that these are peltasts with the small crescent shield and the javelins. And I'm looking at that thinking, who's to say they weren't Iphicratean peltasts? They weren't modified hoplites with small peltasts and long pikes.
I think the problem is it's tricky because we only have, as with so many other things, we've only got Greek sources telling them about them, and they are used later as light troops, and therefore they've always been light troops, and they never had any other kind of troops. Although, as we just discussed, we know they had cavalry. We know that they are fighting in the Homeric wars, presumably in the same style as anyone else, not this kind of radical different style and so you could maybe argue that if they have strong cavalry, the idea of light armed troops amongst cavalry and as a defense against cavalry with missiles, maybe, who knows? But again, the later image of the Thracian in Roman terms, in popular culture, of course, is the Thracian gladiator, who's not armed with a crescent shield and not armed with javelins. They're armed with a small shield, still a pelte, but a curved Thracian dagger. And of all of the gladiatorial types, that again in that amazing transitional period between the late Republic and the Empire, all of the gladiatorial types from the early Republic disappear. So the Gallic gladiator, the only one who stays is the Thrakes. And you then have the Secutor and the Retiarius into the Empire, but the Thrakes is the only common thread throughout that entire period, and their armament stays the same. So that kind of just throws a whole. Well, why are they called Thracian? Because they're not light armed. They're not armed with javelins. They're and they would always fight would they fight the hoplite? I think. The early Republic type.
Genuine heavy infantry was actually, I think, the rarer thing in the ancient world. Coming to mind, there's the Greek hoplite, its variants, and then there's the Roman legionary. So the question may not be, well, why did the Thracians fight as light infantry? It's why did the Greeks and Romans develop heavy infantry? Because when I think of most of the peoples around the Mediterranean, the ancient Mediterranean, they either fought as light infantry, or they copied the Greeks and or the Romans and fought as heavy infantry. But the natural state of affairs, I think, before contact with either the Greeks or the Romans was some sort of lighter, open order infantrymen. That was how they fought, and the heavy infantry tended to be more of a Greek and Roman thing.
So if we extend our Warhammer 40k analogy, they're the armored power armor. They're the very rare, very powerful power armored
Terminator armor.
Servants of the Emperor. Yeah, exactly.
This is my group of nerds. It's really wonderful. It's like coming home. Moving seamlessly between ancient history and Warhammer 40k.
So Chris who's watching live has just sort of queried, what can we have a quick rundown of exactly what records there is left, sort of archaeologically? I mean, where does it lie? I mean, is there a bias on to the Roman sources, to the Greek sources, so which might slew our view of them?
Absolutely, yes, right, from the written sources. But from the archaeological sources, there are 2 or 3 really famous tomb drawings that have been reconstructed. And I'm looking at the one from Kazanluk right now. There is another one from Letnitsa. And these are big barrel finds with a lot of silver engraving and a couple of, they look like peace negotiations between Macedonian or other Hellenistic, because their representatives are wearing the causia. Again, apologies if I'm not pronouncing the Kini Greek there correctly for the hat that the Macedonians wore, with Thracian warriors. And of course, a lot of grave finds of actual arms and armor. But Thracians have left us, to the best of my knowledge, no literary sources. And let me pause there in case I'm wrong.
Just about, if you want to read about the Thracians more than in the wonderful issue Ancient Warfare that's just out, this book is Christopher Webber, Gods of War, that has pretty much whatever there is in there. And I think he mentions that there's like a couple of very short bits of text, but that's it. If it is from the other side, as Murray says, it starts with Homer. They turn up almost constantly throughout ancient Greek historical narratives.
They're a very popular artistic trope in classical Greek pots. You get Thracians.
Yeah, but that's almost all 5th century and earlier. I think the ones with the nicely patterned capes. That's all pretty early. It seems to change or disappear later.
And the other thing I want to reiterate is that there is a very, very strong argument that Bithynia is an ultimately successful Thracian civilization. So there's a lot of documentation about Bithynia and a lot of documentation about the various Prusius' relationships with the rest of the Hellenistic world. And that's a place to look. For Thracians, you have 2 influences, right? You have Thracians coming across the Hellespont from the northwest, and you have Ionian Greek influences coming up from the south, and then, of course, Persian influences from the east. But that civilization is arguably a Thracian one.
If I can weld two patron questions together, from Victor and Chairman, Victor asks, were they a distinct ethnic group? Of which Chairman suggests perhaps they were just Greeks with an accent. Is the latter description more right than a necessarily distinct ethnic grouping?
I remember having read about the Thracian. The language is actually different, and there seems the Greeks make a difference between Illyrians. Further on the western coast of the Balkans, and the Thracians on the eastern, and there's some people in the middle where it's not very clear who they really belong to. But I mean, such distinctions are incredibly difficult to say anything useful about. I mean, the best example is the Roman era, where if you try to track where the Romans say a certain Germanic tribe is supposed to be, then either those tribes constantly move everywhere, all over the place, or they switch names, or both, or it's, really not very clear to the Romans who is what, and they're all sort of similar. I mean, in the archaeological, we've said it before, I'm sure, in the archaeological record, it's barely possible to distinguish Celt from German. certainly in the sort of area of several hundred kilometers both sides of the Rhine.
In those tombs that have been discovered, were there any bones, and if that's the case, has any dental genetic work been done to try and identify any kind of regional affinity?
I think it was mentioned that there are. I'd have to find the original archaeological report again. It is available online.
But the fact that you said they speak a different language, I think, is very telling. I mean, that would tell me that clearly it's not a dialect of Greeks.
It's uncomfortable to talk about, but there would probably be some ethnic differences as well, physical differences as well. But I want to point out that, so for example, when I was in Iraq, I wasn't gray then. All the gray that you see in my beard was red. And when I would meet Iraqis, they would immediately start speaking Arabic to me, assuming I was not an American. Mm-hmm. And when I asked about it later, they all thought I was Circassian, North Syrian. Because in the north of Syria, there's an enclave of Syrians who are basically white. They're white Arabs, and they have red hair, and they have blue eyes, a lot of them, probably from Galatian influences going back into the ancient world. And from what descriptions I've read in Xenophon and in Herodotus, it sounds to me like the Thracians would have been ethnically similar in type, somewhat, as opposed to darker hair and darker eyes that you might have found, say, in the Peloponnese and southern Greece. But again, that's a very, very vague.
So Indo-Europeans a branch of that. That's as far as we can say, basically. Yeah.
I think seeing the Thracians as an Indo-European people is it's a strong identification. I think that ancient Europe was filled with peoples who didn't quite fit into the Celt, German, Greek, Roman categories that we ordinarily have. I'm thinking, in addition to the Thracians, there were the Illyrians, there were the Dacians, there were other people such as the Iberians who they're all there and were not Celtic or Germanic. So I think that seeing the Thracians as an Indo-European people who were inhabiting the mountainous country of Thrace is, I think it's probably the best we can say as to their origins.
It's really interesting because my wife, brown-haired, brown-eyed, gets spoken Greek to in Australia, being not Greek, but we live in a Greek suburb. So they just assume she's Greek and will start speaking Greek, which is like, oh, no, don't do that. And the funny thing, of course, is that even though there's still these perceptions, you've got a blonde Alexander, you've got red-haired individuals throughout the ancient world who crop up presumably as exceptions, and yet they're completely accepted. Blonde Pompey and all these sorts of things are very kind of like, it just happens to be blonde. So I don't know whether they're as kind of strict as we'd like them to be.
I suspect, by the way, that the Greek referring to someone as blonde doesn't necessarily mean Nordic European, Northern European blonde in the way that a modern person would think. Mousy colour can appear to be blonde if everybody else has black or brown hair. And I actually do wonder. Alexander didn't have blonde hair, did he? He was dark.
I think there are certainly Pompey was identified with them because of the blondness of their hair. I think, but I think. It's like
right, but what I'm saying is it's on.
It's the relative thing.
I'm just saying it's on a continuum. So, for example, one of the characters. It's interesting that earlier there was reference to Teutoburg. The living brother of Arminius, for example, whose name was Flavus. They actually gave him the nickname Flavus, which apparently translates roughly as Blondie. And the Romans were struck by the fact that this man had this shot of golden hair, which we don't know what that means exactly. But the point, it was clearly different than they were normally used to seeing. To the point where they gave him a nickname.
I was reading a description of Helen, and the Homeric description of Helen does not mention a color of hair, and yet virtually every depiction of Helen has her as blonde and blue-eyed. It talks about the shimmering nature of her hair and the that it glows. It doesn't talk about a color at any point, and nor does it give her.
Except for that fantastic comic book, Age of Bronze. I can't remember who the name. You guys know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It's such a good comic, and such a good way to bridge to get history to people who might not otherwise consume it. I just love Age of Bronze. For your listeners, I just love that comic to death, and you will see a dark-haired, dark-eyed Helen in that.
That talks to our tropes. That talks to our models of what we think beauty are.
The article was making that point, but across the ages, that it's like all great poetry, the beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and therefore there's actually very little specific descriptor of Helen's beauty, but she's gorgeous, and therefore the listener / the culture can make her whatever they want to. Whoever would launch 1,000 ships does not have to be Lana Turner. And so it's just that trope sort of has come in. But, the striking eyes, and I think Athena as well, the eyes.
Really loves board gaming and is willing to pay my mortgage. That's what my brain fills in.
But I think what these things do very convenient. If you're a Greek playwright presenting, to an Athenian audience beneath the Acropolis, when you refer to Thracians, for example, everybody kind of knows what that means. It's this foreign group up in the north. They have these kind of funny ways, and they dress a certain thing, and everybody can get their reference points, and it's a very unique, neat shorthand. And when they don't exist, for example, the Greeks and Romans create them. So it's very interesting to me. Somebody mentioned, I think, Marc, you did about the Iberians. Well, of course, the Iberians were lots of different groupings of people, many of which weren't related. The Cantabrians, Asturians, all these other people down in the south. But the Romans loved to group these people together. They were organizers, as much of the mind as anything else. And part of their political process was, of course, to shape these communities to conform to their worldview. So they would call that whole group north of the Rhine Germani. They may not think of themselves as that way at all, but the Romans made them that.
Isn't it wonderful that history's come full circle then, and therefore Romans, no matter whether they're from early Republic or very, very late Rome, all wear lorica segmentata, all have rectangular shields.
There we go. Made of leather,
and all have, and all have Attic. Yes, of course, it could be leather. And of course, they all have Attic helmets. I love that they're all Romans. Romans for all time. It's like full circle.
They would have actually got the joke. I think they would have understood it.
If, as you suggest, Lindsay, it's almost like pigeonholing areas as a way of making things simple. Cosmo, another one of our patrons suggested might there be a confusion between sort of Thracians, Dacians, and Scythians? Might they actually all have been not dissimilar, but somebody later has gone, look, that is Dacia, and actually these peoples were.
Well, don't forget. So the Greeks had people like Eratosthenes and other people. Ptolemy that actually attempted to make world maps, and they tried to create a physical representation of the world around them, imposing names and labels and trying to really make an order out of the chaos. And even when you get to Marcus Agrippa, he famous has this Orbis Terrarum, where everything they supposedly know, the distances between places, it's all on public display, and it's part of the way of explaining we control our world because we understand it. We can show it in a way that no other people can. And oh, by the way, we Greeks, we have places communities all over the place. Romans, this is all ours. Mare Nostrum. So I just wonder that, and in a sense, all empires and all conquering peoples like to do that. I mean, I try to tell my American colleagues, when I came over, I was really surprised that I would look at one of the offices. There was a ceiling-to-floor map, and it was amazing in the size of this thing. But something that struck me very odd. In the middle of this map was North America and South America, and Europe was to the right of it, and China, oddly, was to the left of it. Why? Because the United States and Central America, they were put center in this map. Right now, every European knows, of course, that London's the centre of the universe. So, right. So, but the point I'm saying is, English language encapsulates it. Europe, Near East, Far East. Right. So it's even in the language, and the Romans would have had, and the Greeks had a similar sort of way of describing the world around them. So to somebody in China, they're not east of anybody. So I don't know how they describe their world. It would be very interesting to know.
Angus, to your point, and I'm going to dodge responsibility for this statement by saying that I'm getting it from Chris Webber. So if you don't agree, it's Chris Webber, not me. But he makes the argument. I love that book.
It's great. Yeah. This is Osprey number 360 Men at Arms series, and it's really cool. It's only about sort of 46 pages, but it's great.
In the Weber book, he's making the argument that the Bastarnae, the Getae, and the Dacians are all Thracian branches, and are ultimately descendants from the Thracians that we're talking about, even though they're reckoned differently. So. I mean, maybe.
And getting back to the language argument, I just looked at the intro of, it's the same author actually, The Gods of Battle. It's just a more expanded version. That, as far as they know about language, it seems to be that the Thracians and Scythians and Cimmerians and Sarmatians are all related. So it's a similar ethnic group. There might be differences. It might be that the Thracians, what we think of as the Thracians, are a slightly more settled version than what we think of as Scythians, who live more, on the plains of southern Ukraine. And
well, they're fighting. I will say this much we do know: they're fighting differently, right?
Yeah.
So we have a lot of information that's telling us that while Thracians do serve as cavalry arms, that they're generally almost, and this is a guess here, something like 80% of the source material here describing them is they're fighting on foot. And the Sarmatians, I don't think the Sarmatians ever fight on foot, to my knowledge. And the Saka are famous as horse archers, as are the Scythians. So there's definitely a difference, at least militarily, between how these two peoples are being reckoned as sources.
And I think, again, it comes down to the source material, because the terrain that all of these different peoples are traversing are different. We've got mountainous terrain, we've got plains separated by mountainous terrains followed by valleys. So they're all developing separate cultural identities, separate military identities. So even in a modern term,
it's a good point back to what Marc said earlier. It's kind of stuck in my head, and it's something that maybe we have to do something with. But what causes the difference in this fighting style? I mean, is the Thracian style, for instance, light infantry, and they have light and heavy cavalry, but is light infantry, is that more fit for raiding? I've long time ago read, I think is it John Keegan's book on the history of warfare, that says that anthropologists say that very early very primitive styles of warfare are basically two groups of armies stand across from each other and chuck missiles. And then, once in a while, a hero steps out and maybe challenges somebody. If you think about that, that probably starts to sound familiar to very early interpretations of phalanx warfare. Is that something that maybe that's where the Thracians sort of went? They went into a light version, and there's the argument, which is very heavily debated, that the Greeks went for a more, it's the Western way of war type thing, which is rightfully very criticized, but that the hoplite warfare came around because the Greeks wanted raiding warfare can go on and on and on and on and on. It never really stops, and it never really starts. You just constantly have to worry about something happening. Well, the argument is the Greeks, they have the hoplite is a farmer, and he needs to go back to his farm. So if he needs to defend his polis, he goes out, he wants to have a decisive battle and go back home.
Well, my suggestion would be this. Every combatant is looking for a competitive edge. All right, so you might find that the first time those two sides come together, they're sort of evenly matched, and then you'll end up with this no winner. But then someone comes up with an idea, hey, what if we do this, 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 this? And the next time they meet, they actually find it works or it doesn't work. And then they may standardize around that idea because that gave them the competitive edge until the next opponent comes with something else, and now you've got to up the ante. And I think that if you transpose this over enough time, as these Thracian people are dealing with their own enemies, north, south, and west, probably not so much east, they will encounter these different fighting styles, and they have to use their ingenuity. We see this in their wonderful, metalwork and so on, how adept at making helmets and other things that they were able to. That's how they express their competitive advantage.
Bear in mind also the influence of the Samnites of central and southern Italy on the Roman development of the Roman legion. The Romans apparently adopted their looser order. They originally had some sort of phalanx, a Greek-style phalanx, but in
maybe not. But
combat with
different podcast.
But after some bad goes with the various enemies, they were fighting the Samnites, who fought in hilly country, just like the Thracians did. And the Samnites fought with a looser order. They fought with shields too, but they also threw javelins and seems that that's where the Romans got their use of the pilum from. And I think that terrain has a huge influence over the nature of the warfare that any people are going to practice. The Romans were lowlanders. The Greeks, generally speaking, were lowlanders, even though they lived in a mountainous country. Perhaps there is a difference with the Thracians there, and the Thracians are more analogous to someone like the Samnites with their looser fighting style, which still had great military advantages. For example, Alexander the Great, in his campaigns, he uses it's a big generalization I'm making, but he uses his phalanx to win his large set piece battles. But whenever he's pursuing an enemy, he has to move fast. He's got some sort of special operation to accomplish. He's taking his cavalry, he's taking his Agrianians, his various other light troops with him, and he's leaving the phalanx behind.
We shouldn't rule out also, it's a great point that military endeavors or military styles are reactions to terrain, they're reactions to resources. But the one thing that we shouldn't rule out, I think, is culture as a role in determining what a fighting, how people fight. I'll give two examples that I think you'll both recognize. And the first is the Aztecs, who, of course, one of the reasons they were slaughtered by the conquistadors is that their method of fighting was designed around their religion, where they needed to take captives alive so that they could be sacrificed as part of their faith. The Aztecs are not stupid. They understood that it would be a heck of a lot more efficient to just kill the people you're fighting, but they had a cultural impetus to do otherwise. Another example I love to do is people always ask, when you look at Napoleonic warfare pre-rifle, the stupid question I always asked, and well, not stupid, but, naive question I always asked is, well, why are these people just standing there? They just walk up and line up and stand there. And some of that has to do with the musket, of course, being inaccurate. But some of it has to do with the culture of bravery and what it means to be a man, and that you don't hide behind a tree, and that you don't wear camouflage. You go up and you stand there and you present arms, showing iron discipline, and you fight. And that is a cultural driver to that style of warfare. One of the things that's frustrating when we consider Thrace and the Thracians is that we really don't know what cultural drivers there are. I have this sort of very vague depiction when I read in the Latin and Greek sources about them of almost like a Celtic warband style of life, of these sort of hard drinking, individualistic frontier people with sort of very hard ideas about what it means to be male and what it means to be a warrior. But there's not enough detail there for me to form the same kind of conclusions as I can from, say, reading Bernal Diaz de Castillo's account of the Aztecs and how they fought. So I just don't want to, I want to make sure we don't miss that there may be cultural drivers that we don't see.
I think that one of the other things about it, of course, is that what we know mostly about Thracian warfare is because of their employers from other cultures. So we know about them as Thracian peltasts, Thracian troops being used by Alexander, being used by other Hellenistic kingdoms, being used by Romans. Not Thracian. When Mardonius reconquers Thrace, we don't know what they look like. We just hear this from Herodotus. So the idea that they are, their identity becomes what they are employed as, whether it be mercenaries or a culturally distinct group, whether that culturally distinct group is in fact from Thrace. The fact that we get these terminologies, the Paeonian cavalry, the Agrianians, are they all from Agriane? Are they? We don't know. They're called that. What if you got some casualties? You have to trend back to Agriane to get some more? Or do you just go, yeah, you're going to train in this style now? Which is, again, we don't have enough information to be able to say that for sure. So I think that's the problem as well, is Thracians become Thracians because of how they've been perceived by their employer, rather than what they necessarily perceive themselves as.
So another question from one of our patrons, Chris. He wonders, why didn't a Thracian state or empire form, and then throws in the statement, shall we blame Persia?
The Oorthusian kingdom absolutely was a Persian state, and Suthopolis was a major Hellenistic city, and I've already made the argument for Bithynia. And also, not only did Persian states form, but Persian royal court culture was such that Persia was able to be, Thrace. Thracian court culture evolved to the point where Thracian kings were able to be real serious players, both in the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. So I don't think that assumption is accurate. But please keep patronizing the podcast, even though I just disagreed with you.
Wasn't it Herodotus who said that there are so many Thracians that the only thing that was keeping them from conquering the world was that they were disunited? I think that obviously that statement has probably colored a lot of people's feelings about the Thracians. I think the thing about the Thracians is I wonder, where'd they go? What happened to them? I mean, they were these very tough, ferocious, feared fighters for so many centuries. And then it just seems that it peters out. Were they Romanized? Did they become a lot like many other Roman peoples who were initially, when the Romans would encounter them, fierce, ferocious, very dangerous, and then as Roman civilization worked its magic upon them, they lost their military ways?
There's so many of those sorts of things where you go, well, how did the Huns disappear? The Huns were this big bad guy, and then suddenly boom, they're gone.
I mean, Thrace as a place was called Thrace well into the Byzantine period.
To your point, I think what happened is they simply became assimilated. So, for example, in the same way that the Batavi and the Raiti and Noriki and all these tribal warriors, I mean, for example, it's amazing that the book I've just finished is how the Romans very cleverly, they would annex a place, and within a very short space of time, as part of the treaty, the young men would be signed up to fight in units, and they would become the cohorts or ala something, Noricorum or Thrycor or whatever it would be, and then history would take its course, and then the original Thracian blood wouldn't actually be Thracian anymore; it'd be local blood, and then they'd become part of the landscape, and all that remains is the name, and nobody could actually tell you where Thrace was on a map. And I just think that's the way that evolution takes place in the sort of military context.
I would argue that the history of the Balkans is pretty clear. They Hellenize, right? And actually, you can see, and in that Weber book, if you look at the early plates, when you look at 5th century Thracians, their arms and armor look very different than when toward the end of the color plates in that book, where you see Thracian troops serving under Perseus of Macedon at the Battle of Pydna. They look basically Greek. The only real way to identify them is they're carrying rhomphaeas, which is such a uniquely Thracian weapon. So you have a wave of Hellenization, which they're still Thracians, and then, of course, eventually you have the absorption by Rome. And eventually, I think with the Thracian revolt in 26 AD, I think was the last point at which there was real independence out that way.
I was going to say our final question. I was a second final question, perhaps. But Brian, who was keenly sat for 20 minutes before we even went on air, he came up with the question of Spartacus was Thracian. What other famous Thracians have made their marks in history?
My take on Spartacus, if I can finish with Controversy Corner, is what we have in the sources for Spartacus is the idea that he's Thracian in Capua, but the only people that are mentioned in Capua are Thracians and Gauls. And the problem with that, of course, is that the two gladiatorial types trained in Capua in the 1st century BC are Thracians and Gauls. So not necessarily from Thrace, but a Thracian, as in he fought in a Thracian gladiatorial style. Now, you won't find that in any book because no one seems to have published it, whereas most people can't accept that Spartacus, even Florus and other Roman historians, they have to say that he had been trained as a Roman centurion and had gone AWOL, which is what explains why he was able to defeat Roman armies. That then gets repeated by old modern author, Rome Theories, Grass Crown, McCulloch. Colin McCulloch repeats that. But the idea that he's a barbarian, the idea that he's a ex-slave served in the Roman military comes across. But the Thracian idea, you find, kind of becomes more the history, which is really in 70, first 100 BC, let's say, is a very interesting sort of idea that Thrace is providing Rome with slaves.
So, Murray, there's an article in there. Do you want to put that on your pad of articles? The real Spartacus.
The pad is yes. Would the real Spartacus please stand up? It's even got a title.
I'm Spartacus.
So yeah.
No, that's a very interesting thing. I'd never even thought about that, and it makes so much cogent sense the man got labelled because that was the armour and style of fighting that he was told to do. Right? Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
There are a lot of famous Thracians. Oorthuys II is a pretty famous king. King Oorthuys, who arguably, I think that the Battle of Pydna would have gone a very different way if Perseus hadn't stiffed. I mean, Oorthuys was ready to come with a large army of Thracians to Perseus of Macedon's assistance, and Perseus, at least if you believe Plutarch, stiffed him, didn't want to pay him. And if he had, things might have been very different. There's a lot of very, very colorful and fascinating Thracian heroes that
you gotta pay your mercenaries.
Do have to pay your mercenaries. That's kind of a truism. So, but yeah, I would recommend Google Oorthuys, K-O-T-Y-S, Google Oorthuys, S-E-U-T-H-E-S. You'll find a lot of good stuff out there about famous Thracians.
Well, I'll throw in the other ones, Roy Metelkes, depending how you spell that, and his brother Rometocles, I think it is. They all seem to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They all had like a small number of names that they all seem to have adopted and keep repeating. And it's very confusing when you try to actually conjure up a family tree of these people. But the money was a very compelling reason for doing anything.
Shall we finish with? I have a question. From Bronwyn about the Amazons. If anyone wants to tackle this one, the Amazon Queen. Now, is it Penthesilea? That'll do. Mm-hmm. From the Trojan War epics, is said to have been Thracian. What was the relationship in the Greek mind between the Thracians and the Amazons?
I'm going to say probably if you look in the Adrian Mayer book, you'll probably find a good exposition in that, I would think.
Quickly check the index of this one.
Yeah.
I'm so embarrassed that I don't know. One of the things I really hammer hard and want more of and want to hear more of is discussion of the role of women in ancient warfare. And I'm, to my great shame, I'm not being the example by learning about it myself. So
you would get from the Athenians, of course, is abhorrent, threatening, and it's upsetting of the natural order. Which of course is the idea that they came and besieged Athens and almost took over Athens, and that you get the in Aristophanes even he can make fun of the idea that women would take control and how threatening that was to Athenian manhood, and even the way that they treated their citizen women, locking them away in the middle of the house so that their purity was preserved so they could make more Athenian citizens, and that. Even I was reading recently about Artemisia, because she served the Persian king at the Battle of Salamis, the Athenians had put out a 10,000 drachma reward. So, almost 2 talents of silver for the Athenian captain who would happen to catch Artemisia. The Athenian captain who was in pursuit of her when she rammed one of the Persian ships and he was dissuaded, thinking that she was on their side, was Amenias of Athens, who was the brother of Aeschylus, the playwright, whose other brother was Cinegirius, who died with his hand on the prow of a Persian ship at the Battle of Marathon. Talk about competitive families. You've got Aeschylus, the Athenian commander at Salamis who wins the award for being the most valorous, and one of the commanders at the Battle of Marathon, according to Plutarch, who gets their hand chopped off at the Persian ships. Like, wow, you people, stop competing. Anyway.
And so further, we should do that as a topic, just something to think for future. Not just the Amazons, but I know a recent book was just published on Pen and Sword about women in classical warfare. I think that would be great.
That's the book that Lindsay just mentioned. Yeah. I think.
That's a great topic to be tackled.
Yeah. This is now slightly off topic. It does amuse me that this idea of barbarians and wild northerners, and it's funny how it permeates to. It got me thinking. Game of Thrones. They're in the north. What is it about that? It's in fiction. The north is still this idea of barbarians.
So Angus, you speak with a funny north accent, and I hear it, and I have all these sort of interesting ideas that come with the stereotype, as no doubt I do.
Not even Scottish.
Yeah, but a Brit living in Texas, I have my own kind of baggage that no doubt they bring. No, I think it's just very interesting that what it shows us is that the so-called the worldview of the Greeks and Romans has been that powerful. You could argue toxic, that it permutates all the way through our education systems today, that we still tend to look at the world almost in their terms.
But even if you think, the bogeyman for the northeast of England, it's those northerners, the Vikings and the Danes and coming down. There's always somebody to the north of somebody. There's a.
Well, that's absolutely true, and of course, R.R. Martin actually plays on that, doesn't he, in Game of Thrones? So it's a very haunting idea.
And yet, bizarrely, southernwards invasions are very rare.
There's a geological and weather-based argument to it, which is that the farther north you go, the colder the climate is, the less suited it is to agricultural living, and the more likely you are to develop a raiding culture that's dependent on attacking sedentary peoples in warmer climates to the south. I mean, that's a very general way to put it, but that's one possible.
But so, for example, to take Murray's point, so your point that there aren't that many raids that come from the south. So, for example, there were clearly enemies. So we take Egyptians; they were very worried about the people south of them, and the Romans were also. So, for example, there's I can't even pronounce it now. There's the 30 league line or something. It's the Dodekachinos or something, below which you've got the Ethiopians, and they in fact do raid. And Cornelius Gallus is sent off to try and deal with this whole thing. And I think the interesting thing is, whereas the people north of the Alps are thought of being this terror, which goes back, to the Gauls and to the Germans and the Cimbrians, the Romans look down their nose at the people of the south because they're sunburned and they're somehow primitive in a different sort of way, because they fight with sticks and stones. And as it turns out, they get their butt whacked. So it's very interesting that they get, every so often when you read Strabo and some of these other stories, that they're really quite surprised by what happens. And in Amyrenas, who's the Kandaki, who's the queen of the Kush, actually having lost several battles, negotiates that they want to actually settle up with whoever's in command of the Roman army. And Gallus then says basically, well, that would be Augustus. Okay, we're going to go and see Augustus. And they actually send a deputation. And Augustus is quite taken aback by this, but actually says they're entitled to what they want. Make a deal. So it's just very interesting. So there is this place south as well as north. And again, they bring their own special prejudices to the south as they did to the north.
Well, most of our sources emphasize a Western invasion. And even when they're not specifically west, it's always westwards. They always come from they always invade inland as west, bizarrely, which I think begins with the account of Marathon. But no, what I was going to say is, how do you explain the Danes attacking northern England if it's cold climate attacking warmer climate? Because that makes no sense at all.
Well, because the historians at that time that we get are, the Venerable Bede and all these people who are again looking at that. They're Southerners, so they're looking at sort of a Christian world, looking at these heathens who are, coming and invading God's country, and that makes. I think the East-West thing is interesting because doesn't that in a sense, there's again this great idea of the civilized West and the East, and for Herodotus, of course, it's Persia versus the Greek polis, and of course the polis win. Of course, naturally they would win because they're Western. But by the time you get to the Romans, there's this understanding that actually the Easterners are really pretty impressive people, and they're not easy to beat. And every time they try to go up against them, they realize that they again, like Amyrenas Kandaki, they get their butt whacked. So they sort of wise up.
And
to
on
the
the other hand, there's also Romans with Roman ideas that if you put a legion in the east and you leave it there too long, they become all wussy and effeminate. And if you station a legion somewhere, put them in mines instead of beer drinking, they'll become hardened.
And yet, weirdly, the Gauls are all soft, like they're iron. Strange, so bizarrely inconsistent.
Well, nobody said that classical mind was necessarily logical and consistent. It's bigoted and it's prejudiced, but of course it's
unlike now when we're also enlightened and.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that we come back to this basic idea. There's us, and then there's them barbarians.
There's them, yeah. Now the circle is round.
Right, let's call it a day. I'm Thracianed out. So it's thank you to Jasper, Lindsay, Marc, Murray and Myke. Don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Ancient Warfare podcast. And it's a thank you to those patrons who watched live and commented as we recorded. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.